Hello, my name is Jean-Jacques Nantel. Most people believe it's impossible to make precise predictions about the future. It's false. For instance, it is 100% certain that 1 billion years from now, 2 plus 2 will still be equal to 4, and the quantity of prime numbers will still be infinite, since we know that the laws of our universe are not going to change. It is also certain that exactly 100,000 years from now, the sun and the moon will rise in the east and set in the west. Why? Because enormous quantity of matter and energy are involved, and because there is nothing in the solar system that could change that. For the coming decades also, we can make some valid prediction, since we know that for the first time since the death of the dinosaurs, a massive extinction of species is happening on the planet. An extinction that is caused not by worms or whales, but by the pollution created by mankind and its industries. Until about 1750, our agriculture was copying nature and was recycling most of its garbage, which allowed millions and millions of living species to live on a very stable, comfortable, and durable planet. During the following 100 years, however, the Industrial Revolution, which was a purely linear process, started to produce an ever-growing quantity of trash that was simply thrown away and left to rot in dumps or elsewhere. Since our natural environments were then extremely resilient, and since there were very few industrialized countries on the planet, the situation was still tolerable. It stopped being that way during the two world wars, when two coalitions of industrialized countries did their best to destroy each other without ever considering the damage done to the environment. Unfortunately, that orgy of destruction in Europe and in Asia was followed by the post-war era of unbridled overconsumption called the Glorious 30s. It is because most of our present-day leaders were born and raised during that period of prosperity that they never stopped behaving as if they believed in Santa Claus, at least in the Western world. Raised by people who had suffered a lot and who wanted to protect their children, the baby boomers got used to satisfy all their pleasures, their desires, and their whims by demanding money from their parents or from the governments. To find the resources necessary to subsidize their never-ending party, the politicians did two things. First, in every country, they kept increasing the national debt. And second, they delayed as much as possible the maintenance of the most essential infrastructure. As a result, many Western industries entered in a decades-long decline, which, in a country like USA, created the region called the Rust Belt on the south shores of the North American Great Lakes. In a way, the present leaders of the Western world did not inherit a decadent civilization. They created it. It's worth mentioning here that during their adolescence, humans tend to adopt the ideology of their peer group, an ideology they will keep defending for the rest of their lives without ever wondering how lucky they had been to appear at the right moment in history, in the right country, the right religion, and the right sect. And they can become extremely dangerous for anybody who dares challenging their die-hard beliefs. Galileo, discovered it the hard way in the 17th century when the Catholic Inquisition prosecuted him and threatened to torture him, or worse, if he didn't admit publicly that the sun was revolving around the earth and not the other way around. Another common human defect is that people prefer to be told the most preposterous lies rather than some unpleasant and possibly painful truth. Finally, a lot of people don't care about anything if their interests are not threatened. All that to say that the politicians who dealt with the 2008 subprime crisis were baby boomers who had never experienced hard times and who always considered nature as a sort of trash can. For them, the industrial world had nothing to do with nature, despite the fact that obviously only our natural environments could absorb all the pollution produced in countries as distant as Azerbaijan, India, Spain, Canada, or Cameroon in Africa. In fact, most modern politicians just don't believe humans are powerful enough to destroy the planet. For them, it was a big surprise to discover after the 2008 subprime crisis that the world economy could not be restarted by printing trillions of dollars they didn't have, or by reducing the interest rate to 0% or less. If their national debts, as well as the Dow Jones and the Nasdaq, did reach new heights, the economy remained more or less stagnant. Since the 2020 politicians belong to the same generation as those of 2008, they also did not understand they were dealing with a systemic environmental crisis. Somehow, normal people did understand that growth was no longer possible on the planet since the fertility rates have been declining for decades all over the world. They know by experience that we are too many on the planet. When the COVID-19 pandemic began, our politicians, who were thinking about their re-election, reacted nervously by imposing a general lockdown to more than 3 billion people, which stalled the world economy and encouraged people to hoard as much food and supplies as possible. To boost demand for the products and services consumers could not afford during the lockdown, many governments decided to print money like crazy and to throw it around like candies. The idea here was to maintain the economy in a sort of levitation so that it could restart at the pre-pandemic level after the lockdown. This time, Santa Claus has been so generous that in May 2020, the annual Canadian federal deficit had already reached a staggering 200 billion Canadian dollars, while the total US federal debt had almost passed the $26,000 billion mark. And not even a cent had been budgeted yet to save the banks whose balance sheets were in even worse shape than in 2008 due to the fact that the 0% interest rate imposed by the central banks of the world had made them unprofitable. Since a country cannot file for bankruptcy like a company, it is certain that politicians everywhere will keep printing money after the end of the COVID-19 pandemic in order to save the most important industries of their national economies. For instance, the automobile industry, the aviation industry, or the tourism industry, with all the small and medium-sized enterprises that depend on them. Whatever our leaders do, the disorganization of the economy created by the pandemic and the subsequent lockdown of the population will have created a mass unemployment very similar to the mass unemployment of the 1930s. As a result, a lot of people will become unable to pay their mortgage, and foreclosures will skyrocket as they did during the 2008 subprime crisis. The financial crisis that will ensue will force the governments to approve a general shutdown of the banks, which will allow them to refinance themselves by stealing the money deposited in your bank accounts. In most countries, the stealing I'm talking about has already been authorized by law, and it already occurred in countries like Argentina and Cyprus. As usual, you can verify everything I say by using the bibliography I will put at the end of this video. Of course, when a central bank keeps printing trillions of dollars in a country where the production of goods and services has almost stopped, it creates inflation. This being said, there are reasons to believe that the coming depression will start with a bout of deflation, since most of the money printed by the central banks between 2008 and 2020 has been used to inflate gigantic financial bubbles in the stock market and in the real estate market. When those bubbles will finally burst, the stocks and the housing prices will crash and trillions of dollars will suddenly disappear, which is a form of deflation. In the stores also, there will be deflation due to the fact that many struggling enterprises will be forced to reduce the prices of their unsold products to get the money necessary to avoid bankruptcy. Of course, that deflation will stop as soon as those companies' warehouses will be empty. Inflation and perhaps hyperinflation will then appear due to the ever-increasing quantity of money printed by the central banks. Despite all the social problems hyperinflation will create, governments will keep printing money in order to pay the civil servants, the police, and the army, who will keep them in power. As we can see in modern-day Venezuela, the systematic destruction of a national currency stops when the population no longer bother to pick up the $100 bills that are littering the streets. If hyperinflation can rid the country of its debts, at least the debts denominated in its devalued national currency, it has the great disadvantage to reduce to almost nothing the value of the salaries and the pensions of its population. It happened at the end of the Soviet Union. For a country, such an outcome can be extremely detrimental by making its government unable to perform its normal duties. Again, the Venezuelan example shows that when hyperinflation has crippled the country's economy, nobody, nowhere, accepts to lend real money to its government, which stops repairing its crumbling infrastructure, who can't finance properly its hospitals, its colleges, its universities, and its retirement homes. The homeless and the poorest of the poor are then left to fend for themselves. The depollution of the most contaminated environments cannot be financed, as well as the decommissioning of the most obsolete and dangerous nuclear reactors. Subsidies to realize the energy transition everybody is talking about also dry out, as well as the budget to help the developing countries. And we didn't talk about the enormous cost of developing new technologies, and especially the vaccines we will need in the future to combat new pandemics in a world populated by a much older population. That danger cannot be overstated for many reasons. First, there are humans in the most remote environments of the world, which put them in direct contact with millions of totally unknown viruses and bacteria. Second, if hundreds of millions of Africans are used to eat bushmeat, something similar is happening in Asia, where the Chinese, for example, consume the most astonishing and exotic animals. Third, hundreds of millions of Hindus bathe every year in the sacred waters of the Ganga River, which is among the most contaminated of the world. Fourth, billions of poor and malnourished people are now living in megacities, and especially in favelas where almost nobody has access to sewers, running water, or a garbage collection system. Fifth, in many cultures, people have their skin pierced or tattooed with more or less dirty needles. The fact that all those people, even in the poorest countries, live near international airports that allow them to go anywhere on the planet in a matter of hours, guarantees that someday some new dangerous pandemics will spread like wildfires on the 5 continents. Before ending this video, I'd like to mention that mankind as a whole will lose control over its destiny during the coming environmental collapse. It's not true that the whole thing has been planned and subsidized by billionaires who wanted to steal even more money from the poor. If those billionaires who already control the world economy do everything they can to protect their belongings, they are perfectly aware that if the working classes were to suffer a lot, they could launch a revolution that would put their lives and their liberties at risk. In the past, revolutions often caused the massacre of rich people, of nobles, and even of kings. If our present-day leaders don't understand all that, it's because they lost contact with the real world a long time ago, and because they still believe that an infinite economic growth is possible on a dying planet. By destroying the only support system that can absorb all the pollution it produces, our industrial world is self-destructing. In the next video, I will talk about the most probable political consequences of the coming crisis. As usual, I thank you in advance to share this video on the internet, to like it, to subscribe to my channel, and to help me financially if you can. See you next time.